Pals, I'm here today to talk about the 13 books I read in the month of January. So yeah, I really loved reading in January. I was just picking up lots of books and I'm really hoping this pace and this enjoyment of reading as much as I did in January will continue into the rest of the year. So the first book I read, I actually started in 2021, and that is Burntcoat by Sarah Hall. I finished this on New Year's Day. This came out in the autumn of 2021. It's Sarah Hall's most recent book, and I've read the majority of her bibliography. I've got 2 novels left to read. I think sometimes her writing is super beautiful, but sometimes I'm confused. Sometimes the plot arc isn't particularly strong in her novels. So I was intrigued to see how this one would go. And I think a mixed bag again for me. I gave this one 3 stars. The premise of this is that we're following a middle-aged woman who is a very successful artist. She created a piece of art that sounds like sort of like The Angel of the North, but much more sort of feminist. It's the figure of a witch crouching, and lots of people say it's really vulgar and grotesque, but she's very famous because of it. And she is working in her gallery, which is within her home, around the time that pandemic strikes, and she meets a man who very quickly becomes her lover, and you follow them in this really close containment. Now that's what I knew about the novel going in, but actually in large part this novel is about her childhood and her relationship with her mother. Her mother had a severe accident which made her a completely different person who was had to relearn how to talk and to walk. So lots of her childhood is really shaped by that and being raised by her mother after the accident. So I loved all the sections that were talking about her childhood and her mother. I thought they were beautifully written. I'd love to see Sarah Hall write a coming of age novel. There's a deep connection to the land in those sections, which I thought was really beautiful. And the second half is beautifully written, and she's probably the most sort of sensual writer I've ever read. There's lots of sex that borders on like the beautiful but also the grotesque. She goes quite far into talking about sort of bodily functions and all those sorts of things, which I don't usually like in my novels, but I think Sarah Hall does really well. But I just felt that the second half got super, maybe philosophical. I just felt like I wasn't following everything and I felt a bit of a disconnect. So I enjoyed this one, but I don't think I got everything out of it I could have done, and it's a book that probably could do with a reread, so there's that one. Then a book I'd had on my shelf for quite a few years and was really happy to pick up and read is Bury What We Cannot Take by Kirstin Chen. This is a historical fiction novel which takes place in Mao's China, and we are following a family who live on a small island and they are trying to flee to Hong Kong. And just as the mother is trying to arrange them fleeing, the young son reports his grandmother for smashing a portrait of Chairman Mao, and that has deep repercussions which mean that the daughter has to be left behind when they flee to Hong Kong, and the plan is to go collect her and things go wrong basically. And you follow the story from the little girl's point of view being left behind on the island, and then also from the mother's perspective when she gets to Hong Kong and how she's desperately trying to find a way to either get to her daughter or get her daughter to her. And the little girl I think is about, God, I can't remember for sure, but maybe like 9 years old, so she's fairly young. I found this super readable. I was really intrigued by what was happening to this family. I think its sense of time and place was really strong, and I just found this a really interesting historical period, which I've read about a little bit or would like to read a lot more about. But I think what I found with this novel, and a few of the reviews I read said this as well, is this novel ties up quite neatly in the end, and it also felt like it could have been a longer novel with a lot more development about perhaps the husband and maybe the grandmother. It felt like there was more space to find more out about these people, and also, yeah, I just think that for what the time would have been like, it was perhaps a little bit too, it sounds awful, but like, I don't often read a book and think, surely it would have been bleaker than that, because usually I read quite bleak books, but I read this thinking, this seems fairly optimistic about how this would have actually turned out. So I still enjoyed it, and I think she has a novel coming out later this year that I will probably pick up because I liked her writing style, and this was like a 3-star read for me. Then I borrowed Foster by Keegan from the library because I read her novella, Small Things Like These, towards the end of 2021 and really enjoyed it. And this is a short story of hers that's been published just by itself because it won quite a prestigious short story award. And it is beautiful. I don't want to say much about it because it's a short story. It's a story of a young girl who is sent to live with family friends during the summer in Ireland because she is one of many children and her parents can't really afford to feed them all. And the relationship she builds with this husband and wife, and how she grows and comes to want different things from her life and the repercussions of that when she has to go home. It's just absolutely beautifully written, very slice of life, coming of age. I really recommend it. And the next book is the much read Empire of Pain, The Secret History of the Sackler Dynasty by Patrick Radden Keefe. I listened to this one on audio and it took me, I think, 3 or 4 months to listen to, and I finished it early this year. I've been pretty rubbish with getting out for walks, so I think in part that's why it took so long. But I think in another part it's that I didn't find this one super, like, I wasn't drawn back to it when I got halfway through a chapter or to the end of the chapter. I wasn't like, oh, what's going to happen next? So yeah, it's a weird one because on the one hand I can say, like, this book deserves 5 stars just on the work that went into it alone, like meticulous research. The amount of hours and years he must have spent researching this is insane. So, like, I completely see why everyone's raving about it in that regard, and I think it deserves to win and the prizes it's won because of that. However, I just don't find this particularly interesting. I think I've had a lot of people say that this book is marketed as being about the family, so it doesn't missell itself, but I think having listened to this book, I feel like I'm just much more interested in the victims and how this would have actually had a real life impact on society. And so there's a few other books that I've heard of that deal with that much more. But I guess I just didn't find this book that surprising. So it follows the family from like the early 1900s to the present day, and looks at how they just couldn't give, you know, less of a shit about this horrendous repercussions of the drugs they have produced and marketed. And, you know, I guess the one thing I found the most interesting was that I work in research. I specifically work in medical research, so I am involved in managing the legal issues of lots of clinical trials, and so just hearing about how ridiculously corrupt the system was mind-boggling. So I think I found that more interesting than the family themselves, because I don't know, I just don't know how I'm supposed to be surprised by the fact that these rich white people didn't give a fuck as long as they were making loads of money and gaining more power. Like, shock horror, people are bad. So yeah, I don't know, book's very well done, but it isn't something that I found super shocking or interesting. So yeah, I think it's just an interest level thing for me rather than anything else. Then I borrowed from the library the Transgender issue, An Argument for Justice by Shon, Faye, and I'd highly recommend this one. I gave this 4 stars. Now, this is about the trans experience in the UK, which I think was really fascinating in particular because I find a lot of these books that come out about like these social histories tend to be US focused. We get a lot less of these books published in the UK, so it was really great to read a book like this from a UK perspective and hear about the legislation and the history in my own country. That was really fascinating, and I definitely learnt a lot. What I'll say about this book is I really enjoyed the introduction. And then I think the first 2 or 3 chapters are more like an introduction to the idea of what it is to live in a trans body, and to when you sort of come out to people and how that transition is dealt with, in particular for young children. And I think that those chapters I was enjoying, but I wasn't getting as much out of the book as I thought I would based on reviews. But once I got to page like 80, 100, Shon Faye goes into much more depth about specific topics. So she talks about, for example, the criminal justice system, the incarceration system, and things like that. And I think I got much more information that I hadn't previously got from other books I'd read or sort of documentaries I'd watched. So I will say, if you're reading the start of this book and you're thinking, oh, this isn't going as deeply into these topics as I was expecting, that's because those first couple of chapters are more of a sort of broad sweeps. This is the broad picture, and then after that Shon Faye really does dive much more into these specific topics. So yeah, I think, you know, this isn't a 5-star read for me because it isn't beautifully written. There's nothing about this book where I was like, oh my god, like I'm blown away by the writing in and of itself, but in the information Shon Faye is delivering, she delivers it very well, and there's a lot of passion behind her words. And I also thought this book was very inclusive. Shon Faye's always open about the fact that she is from a white middle class family, so she's somebody who has transitioned with a lot of privilege compared to the vast majority of people who transition. So yeah, I'd highly recommend this book. This is the sort of book that I think, you know, should just be taught in schools, in particular in the UK, but you know, in other parts of the world if they don't have a version of it in their country. So I'd highly recommend this one. Then I read They Called Us Enemy by George Takei, which is a book I have wanted to read for a while. It's a graphic memoir. I really enjoy graphic memoirs. and I reserved this at my library and just had to wait a really long time during the last year or so because of lockdown. Like, somebody's been allowed to have that from the library for like months, which is absolutely fine. So I finally got to this one. I had no idea who George Takei was. Like, I've never watched Star Trek, so that was quite interesting as I went through this book, realising that he is like a famous actor, and he, you know, with this platform, did a TED talk, and then I think the TED talk inspired this memoir. This memoir is about the fact that George Takei is Japanese American, and during World War II, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, as I'm sure a lot of you know, a lot of Japanese people were forced to go into internment camps during the war, because the government at the time believed that they could turn on their fellow Americans, and that they were not American and were Japanese and were going to, you know, serve their own country of Japan. And they lived in really horrific conditions. And this is a memoir about George Takei's experiences. He was a young boy, and he went into the internment camps with his brother, his baby sister, and his mum and dad. And it's about how his parents coped with that, how they still found happiness and sort of social structure within these internment camps, sort of the strength of both of his parents in doing that, and also the decisions his parents had to make as the government sort of started to change the policy within these internment camps. I enjoyed this book. For me, it's like a freestyle read because I find that this is a topic I already knew a bit about from documentaries and other books I've read, and I guess I feel like what I want now is to read just a big non-fiction book that focuses on this topic and gives a lot more information, whereas this is, you know, obviously it's a graphic memoir, so it's relatively short, there's not a ton of information, but I definitely recommend it. In particular, if you don't know anything about this history, then it's definitely a book you should pick up. Then a book that I bought with some of my Christmas money, so I was really happy to get to it pretty quickly, is The Raptures by Jan Carson. This is her new novel. This came out in January, and this is the first book of hers I've read, although I am intrigued by her backlist. This is a really fascinating book, so very different to anything I've probably read before. This is set in Ireland during the Troubles, and it is from the perspective of a young girl called Hannah, who is I think around 11 years old. She lives in a very small village with a very sort of insular community, and she is raised by a very religious family, so she really struggles to connect with the other children in her classroom. And it's the start of the summer holidays, and she's sort of, you know, thinking, oh, this is going to be a bit boring because she doesn't have, like I said, many friends. And then basically the children in her class all start getting very quickly and suddenly ill and then dying. And the town realise that there is some infection that the children must have, and so people are sent to try and figure out what the hell is going on and to stop this infection before all of the children die. But as soon as the first child dies, very early on in this novel, that child's sort of ghost visits Hannah, but when they're grown up, like sort of like a teenager, I guess, when they're like sort of 18, and Hannah is sort of living in fear of like, why are these people coming to me? What does this mean for my religion? Like, would my parents think this is sacrilegious? Do I tell somebody? How do I cope? And why have they chosen me? And as these ghosts visit her, they're telling her that they are in a replica of the village that is completely empty, and they're sort of telling her, some of them are encouraging her to join them and saying, oh, it's great, we just get to do whatever we want, and the other half are saying, you know, it's horrible, and she's just trying to deal with all of that. So that's what I knew about this going in. I assumed from the description that this was going to be like sort of supernatural. It isn't. It's very much an infection that has a real life reason, which I think is pretty obvious from the get-go. So I didn't really mind that that was super obvious, but just like, if you want this to be really twisty, it isn't. Like, it's pretty clear what the infection is caused by from the start, and so that didn't feel like a big reveal to me. But I really enjoyed this. She writes really differently. This is very wittily written, really funny. This felt sort of like Jacqueline Wilson on drugs, in that it is you know, told from the perspective of an 11-year-old. It has those bites of humour and warmth and confusion of this young child, but it's also just really fucking weird. And Hannah says really bizarre things. She's a, you know, quite an odd child because of the way she's been raised. Yeah, and I really enjoyed it. And what this book does is it moves from Hannah. So you see things going on in the village that Hannah doesn't know about these other children, and about what could have caused the infection. And so you're seeing what it's like in this village, and the type of people that exist there, and how sort of insular and gossipy it is, how that affects this situation. So yeah, I found this a really unique novel. I really enjoyed it. I gave it 4 stars, and I'll definitely be reading her backlist books. And another book that I bought for Christmas and read really quickly is Damnation Spring by Davidson. I really felt like reading a chunky family drama, and that is what this is. This is set in the 1970s in the Californian redwoods, and we are following this novel predominantly from the perspective of a husband and wife, although we do get very few chapters from their young son's perspective. And the premise of this is that the husband has worked as a logger for like 30 years. He is, I think, around 20 years older than his wife. And he comes across the opportunity to purchase a large area of land in which he can log and make a shit ton of money. And so he buys this land in secret because he doesn't want his wife to know that he's sort of spent all their money on this really risky purchase. And at the same time as that happens, his wife has, they have a young son together, but we know very quickly in the novel that they have suffered many miscarriages together, both before and after their son was born, and the wife is desperate for another child, and in this desperation, at the same time as the husband's bought this plot of land, we start to have lots of people coming to the area to protest the logging of the woods, and also a man that the wife had sort of a teen romance with comes back to the area, and he is a scientist who believes that the pesticides they spray on these areas before they log them has infiltrated the water system, and he thinks that has something to do with all the miscarriages, and a lot of the children in the area are born with difficulties that he thinks again are caused by these chemicals. So really it's focusing on the culmination of the protesters, how the logging company reacts, this researcher and the danger he's putting himself in. The wife is in this situation of this push and pull, and the fact that her husband has been complicit for many years, and this is their bread and butter, this is how they've survived, but could that be the reason that she and many of the women in the area have struggled so much with childbirth and with their children? So it's really examining all that, and all that sounds fascinating to me. However, a couple of key problems I had with this novel. The first is that the author has loads of characters in this book, to the degree where I think it probably needed a character list at the start. And to begin with, I've been introduced to these new characters and I'll be like, I just can't remember who they are. Like, definitely struggled with who people were in terms of the logging company, the hierarchy of the logging company. And I kept thinking, oh well, like later on she'll make it clearer, but she never does. And so I read this novel really struggling as to who a lot of these secondary characters were, which is something I read in lots of other people's reviews. And also this author gives a lot of detailed descriptions of the logging, and no matter how many times I read them, I couldn't picture what she was describing. So I tried to find videos online of the type of logging these men were doing, and I couldn't. So I really struggled with that. And also I think, in a way I admired this, but it just made it a difficult novel to enjoy. In particular, the husband sections, there's a lot of dialogue with the men when they're on site doing the logging, and it feels like, because you don't understand the logging, you're always on the outside of the conversation, struggling to understand what they're talking about. And there's a lot of jokes where I just felt like I was missing the point. She does the opposite of holding your hand, which, like I said, I admire, but I think she went too far with it, because it just made it a novel that I felt constantly confused by. And I also just feel like it was too long for the story it was telling. I don't think it really warranted this amount of pages. So it's a weird one, because I was reading it feeling quite disappointed, but at the same time, my memory of this is that it was interesting. There's a lot of the characters who I really enjoyed, in particular the wife, sister and husband were really interesting characters. But yeah, it's a weird one. So I think I would probably pick up something this author wrote in the future, but this ended up being like a 3-star read for me. And one thing I will say without spoiling anything is I really didn't like the ending. I had a really big issue with it, and I just felt it was completely unnecessary. And again, that was something I saw in lots of people's reviews, so that was a shame. And then I picked up Oh Beautiful by Jung Yun. I ordered this book from the US in December, and it took about a month to get to me. So as soon as it arrived, I picked it up. And I was really happy to read this one straight after Damnation Spring, because they have quite a lot of similarities, and I felt like they were really in conversation with one another. So this book is by the author who wrote Shelter, which was a super buzzy book when it came out. So I was really surprised when this book came out towards the end of last year, and I didn't see everyone talking about it. Having read the book, I understand why, because it is completely different to Shelter. However, I do think the author clearly has some interest in specific sort of thematic elements which both the book shares, and those being sort of gendered violence and class and power. And I think this book explores those really deeply. So the premise of this book is that we're following Eleanor, who is a 40-something Korean American, and she used to be a model, but she has in her adult life retrained as a journalist, and a contact she has offers her the chance to go and write an article back near where she lived in North Dakota about the oil boom. And so she goes to this town and tries to meet up with all the people he had arranged, because he was planning to write this article and for reasons you find out can no longer do it himself. And so she's sort of meeting with his contacts and trying to figure out what the story really is here. But she's a very sort of troubled woman who really doesn't know what she wants to do with her life, and I usually really struggle with unlikable characters. And to begin with, I didn't really dislike this character, but actually as you get further through, as she meets some people, she makes some quite quick and cruel judgments about people, so she isn't a very likeable character, but that's definitely something the author's aware of, and I found it really interesting to follow someone who was being treated really badly. So the area is super racist and sexist, and because of the oil boom, as I'm sure lots of you know, particularly US viewers, the area is like 85% men, because so many men have come into the area to work, and with that there's been a really big increase in sexual violence by men against women, and there's also been a really big drive by the community of people who lived there before the oil boom to make the community white again. Basically, they don't like the fact that a lot of the people coming there to work are immigrants and are not white, and so it's a really racist and sexist community, and it feels like a really dangerous place for her to be alone as a woman of colour. So I thought all that was handled really well. I found this super interesting. I definitely want to read a non-fiction book about the oil boom and about how the links that has with gendered violence and missing and murdered women. So if you have any recommendations for books about that topic, do let me know. So to a degree I really enjoyed this, and I found it super readable. I read this in like 2 sittings. However, this book is fairly plotless, to the point where when I finished it I was like, has this book like missed the last 30 pages? Like, is there something missing? So if you are somebody who wants a plot to your story, there isn't really one. She goes there to write an article, she comes across people along the way, she has some conversations, she thinks about the article. That's sort of it, okay? There's not some big reveal at the end, and it sort of feels like maybe there is going to be a storyline start to do with this interest she has in this certain case she hears about, and that doesn't really develop into some big story. So this is super different to Shelter. I still enjoyed it. I'd give this like 3.5 stars because I do just think it felt like it just ended, but I think thematically I really like how she writes about these themes, and I'm interested to see what she does next. Then I read from the library Show Us Who You Are by Elle McNicoll. I read her first book, A Kind of Spark, I think last year, and really enjoyed it. So she writes middle grade books, this is her second middle grade book, and I definitely enjoyed this less than the first one, which really disappointed me. I gave this one 3 stars, and I did still enjoy it, but I had a few issues with it. And I guess what my takeaway is from this is that I feel like A Kind of Spark was a book that, yes, was written for children, but was still really readable for adults. But I felt this one just had a lot of plot holes that as an adult I noticed, and I wouldn't have noticed though I was a child. So the premise of this is that this is set in like some type of futuristic world, although that's never really explained, which is one of my issues. And we're following a young girl who is autistic. She meets a young boy and begins this friendship with him, and he has ADHD. So a lot of the discussions around them forming this friendship, and their discussions about how living with autism or ADHD shape their lives, and the different ways in which they care for one another and are sort of considerate of when the other one needs to just have some time to themselves is really beautiful, and I really liked those parts, and they felt much more reminiscent of A Kind of Spark. But the key storyline is that the young boy's dad runs a institute called the Pomegranate Institute, where they're trying to create holograms. Specifically, they're trying to create holograms of people so that when they pass away, their family can go and visit their hologram, and it's like they haven't died. And the children get really involved with this institute. And yeah, I just felt like there was so many things to do with the institute that just didn't really make sense, and felt quite undeveloped. This felt like it needed to be a much longer novel, And there was just a couple of key things that I don't want to say because they'd spoil the plot that I didn't think make sense, particularly a decision towards the end of the novel made by adults in the book that I just thought was super unfair and like couldn't believe Elle McNicoll had decided to write that in. So yeah, this was like an enjoyable read whilst I was reading it, but I had a few issues and just felt like I'd much rather Elle McNicoll stuck with a realistic world and did that slice of lifestyle because I really loved that in the first book. Then a book I'm not going to talk much about because everybody has spoken about it and I love it just as much as everybody else, and that is The Secret Lives of Church Ladies by Deesha Philyaw. Lots of you told me to listen to this on audio, so I did. I read it alongside the audio and it's phenomenal. I'll write the audiobook narrator's name along here because she is brilliant and I just love this. These are all wonderful and I completely agree with what everybody said. It's weird because thematically they're all quite similar, but they didn't feel like I was just reading the same character again at all. It felt like I was reading about a group of women and girls who had similar experiences but were individuals in and of their own right, which is something I really admired. Obviously lots of people talk about Peach Cobbler, which I agree is brilliant, but I also really love Jael and Dear Sister. Those were probably my three favourites, but like I still gave other stories in this collection 5 stars because I thought they were brilliant. So I will 100% pick up whatever this author brings out in the future. And the next book I had on pre-order for January and I read it as soon as it arrived, and that is Fiona and Jane by Chen Ho. I really enjoyed this book. I gave it like 4.5 stars and I'd highly recommend it. I think a lot of people whose reviews I was seeing on Goodreads were giving this really low ratings because they thought this was a novel and then realised it was a collection of short stories, and like that really annoyed them. So I think going in you should know that this is a collection of short stories and, you know, read it for what it is, and in what it's doing I think it's brilliant. This is a collection of short stories told about these 2 girls and then women called Fiona and Jane. They are 2 Taiwanese American girls who grow up in California and are best friends as children and then grow apart in their sort of 20s and come back together later in life, I think probably in their late 30s, early 40s. These stories are non-chronological. The stories about Jane are told in first person and the stories about Fiona are told in third person. And these stories could all be read as standalones in that you might learn things about each of these women that happened when they were young girls, but then another story might reference those things as though you don't know about them. So it's like each story is a new conversation that Fiona and Jane are having with someone in their life. It's like they're talking about, so you get different perspectives on the same incident because they don't talk to you like, oh well, you know, I said this about it last time. They talk like they've never discussed that topic, which I thought was really smart and really unique because it allowed you to see how as they grew and changed, how their perceptions of these same events grew and changed. I really loved it. In particular, I really enjoyed the stories about them being young girls and teenagers. So Fiona grew up in Taiwan with her mother and moved over to America when she was, I think, around 6, whereas Jane was born in the US, but then we have a story from her perspective where she goes to visit her father in Taiwan when she's a teenager because he has moved back there. And there are some really sad topics in this book. In particular, I'd say this book has trigger warnings for suicide and for severe depression, which I felt were really well discussed, and I think these things that happened to these young women, you really saw them play out, like how they affect them both so differently. And like I said, some of these stories are set in Taiwan, some are set in California, which is where they both grew up, and some are set in New York, which is where Fiona moves to as a young adult and lives there for much of her adult life. I thought this was brilliant and I will read whatever this author brings out in the future. And then lastly, I crammed this one in on the last evening of January, and I think I probably shouldn't have done that. So I think in part my feelings about this book are shaped by the fact that I just shouldn't have read this at like 10 o'clock at night in one sitting, but I also am just a bit disappointed by this book, and that is People Change by Vivek Shraya. I previously read the subtweet by this author and loved it, and I also read her poetry collection, Even This Page Is White, and loved it. So I was really pleased to see she had a new essay collection coming out. This is super teeny, as you can see, and the font is like pretty big, so there isn't a ton in here. And I think that's part of my problem. So the premise of this collection is that Vivek is talking about the fact that people change and people can sort of be reborn in different iterations of themselves in their life, and they use Madonna as an example of this. And Vivek herself says that she's changed a lot throughout her life, and that's something people seem to have an issue with. People seem to regard change as you not knowing who you are, and you almost like betraying yourself, and it's her examining why people have that issue with people changing, and why the reverse isn't true if somebody stays the same. Now, in part, I felt like there just wasn't enough space in this collection to really get into any of these discussions. Like, I just felt like I'd rather this was a much bigger book that had much more of an opportunity to really dive into these topics, because I felt like sometimes she'd make a point and I'd think, oh yeah, like let's talk about that way more, and then she'd just move on. And another issue I had with this book is I felt at times Vivek was sort of arguing against herself, because at a couple of points I think she made asides that were like a bit dismissive of people who don't change, and people who you know, I don't know, keep the same fashion sense their whole life, or don't change their taste in music or the way they present themselves. There was a point at which she sort of said, you know, that was a bit stagnant, and I think that either ways of living are fine and acceptable, and I think that's what the argument of the book should be, that like we shouldn't have an issue with people changing, we also shouldn't have an issue with people staying the same, and I don't think the argument should have been people changing is better, and the people who stay the same are the ones we should be dissing. And that only came up a couple of times, but it just didn't sit right with me, and I felt it sort of went against the argument of the book of being like accepting of everybody. So yeah, a bit of a disappointment. I think some people are really loving this book, it just didn't really work for me. So those are all of the books I read in January. I'd love to know if you read them and what you thought of them, and I'd also like recommendations for books that deal with the topics of A Beautiful and Damnation Spring. I really liked those topics about like how industry has an impact on all sorts of different things like the environment, but also social conditions, and also just books like Fiona and Jane and The Secret Lives of Church Ladies, because I adored them both. So yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!